And I know this is going to be sort of a large question here, but how does this result in what you term deglobalization? And what does that actually mean?
Well, it's going to mean something different for everyone. Oh, sorry, bumped the table. Remember that there
Waves.
are two aspects, two things you need for globalization to work. Number one, you need the physical interconnectivity, the transport systems that are low cost and very, very safe. The lower the cost of transport per unit, the more steps you can get in your supply chain, the greater capacity there is to expand into things that otherwise would be so low cost that you wouldn't trade them internationally. Things like wheat, for example, or plastics. Second, you need a balance of production and consumption, and that in many ways is a subset of demographic structures. So you need to have a significant number of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s in order to generate the capital and the skilled labor base to produce, but then you also need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to do some of the lower skilled stuff as well as consume. And this all has to be in balance for it to work. The demographic aging we've seen in recent decades means that that second piece is just completely gone. And countries are increasingly find it in their best interest to kind of hoard what consumption they do have and not allow trade access to it, and then producing more locally. We were moving this way before the Ukraine war, before the Chinese started to break down, and before the German industrial model started to implode. This has just sped everything up. As for the first end with transport, there we're kind of we're kind of in this hanging moment where we're waiting for someone to take the first shot now that the
Hmm.
Americans lack the capacity to protect the system. But even if we don't get a formal conflict over transport, by everyone kind of hoarding the production and consumption zones for themselves, we no longer have a vested interest anywhere in the world in what happens over the horizon. And as long as that is the case, we can get regional transport breakdowns that, from our point of view, don't affect us. But from everyone else's point of view, it's a bit of a disaster. And the more linked in your country is to these networks, the more vulnerable you are. So, China, Korea, Germany, very much so at the very top of that list for different reasons, but they're all dependent upon the inflow and outflow. And so, you can damage global transport significantly before the Americans really notice. Not only is the United States one of the world's biggest mining countries for raw materials, so is Canada, so is Mexico. Brazil isn't that far away, and it's all in the same hemisphere. So you can have an Eastern hemispheric breakdown, which today, three-quarters of population, three-quarters of energy, three-quarters of food production, three-quarters of manufactured goods. And for the most part, the Western hemisphere actually does better.
Hmm. Okay. So, can you give us an example of what this means in a specific sector like smartphones, right? If we just don't have the ability to manufacture components in all these different places and move them into one place to then get manufactured and then ship those out to be sold, what is that? What happens, right? Because I can't even imagine this world where that system doesn't exist anymore.
Sure. Well, the smartphone industry is probably simultaneously the most sophisticated and spread out in terms of globalization and manufacturing, and the most vulnerable.
That's why I picked it.
Yeah, fair enough. So the iPhone has 1,400 supply chain steps that touch 50 different countries. So you'll get the plastics probably from a precursor material that comes from the United States. You'll get the copper probably from Chile, but it's probably processed in China. It's probably built into an integrated circuit in Taiwan, with the design happening in California. And the system on a chip that kind of ties it all together is probably from Japan, but it is made out of components from throughout Southeast Asia, and so on and so on and so on. You miss one of these, you don't have a phone.
Mhm.
And what discovered, what Apple has discovered under Tim Cook, Tim Cook was brought in to operationalize the supply chain to make it the most efficient it could be, and in doing so, 90% of those supply chain steps now in some way touch China. And what we've discovered with these COVID lockdowns of the last 2 weeks is that the facilities are no longer functioning. So Apple has stopped. I have a phone that I ordered 2 months ago that was supposed to be delivered 2 weeks ago, and now I've been received a notice that it's probably not even been built yet.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that they were that far behind. I
Yeah,
figured they
well, they
just,
do have a facility in China with 100,000 people. And so,
whoa.
when that goes offline, do the math.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, this is not the death of Apple.
Hmm.
They've got billions in the bank. They can rebuild their supply chain in other
Oh, you already
places.
paid for the phone. They're
Yeah,
fine.
exactly.
Yeah.
But that's a 5-year process. So This iPhone that I'm trying to get is probably the last one for a while until they completely rebuild their supply chain so it's China free, because China is no longer a reliable manufacturing partner.
Oh, wow.
And they're going to have to do that in places they don't have operations. You don't do that overnight. You don't do that cheaply. And Apple will be doing this at the same time other sectors are trying to do the relocation at the same time.
Sure.
So, because of demographic reasons, we have an absolute cap on how much labor we have available in the United States. Same with Canada. Mexico is in a better position, but there's still an upper limit. So everyone who's trying to nearshore or reshore or friendshore at the same time has to compete for an absolute upper limit of labor availability. And we're now seeing that happen across the entire manufacturing world.
Oof, that seems. I mean, the gravity of this is extreme because when we start looking at, okay, we have to move all this. Oh, and so does every other company. So now they need to find people that were in places where they can build factories, get the property, get the licenses, have the local fixers do whatever they need to do. Except now 500 or 5,000 companies need to do the same thing with the same staff in the same place. The prices are going to go up. The amount of people that can help them do this is going to just be, it's finite. First of all, they just can't work on 8,700 projects at once. It's not possible. And all of that kind of has to happen at the same time, or at least they're in a race to do that because otherwise they can't really make money.
Yeah, the smart firms started this process in the last year of the Obama administration. Now, maybe for wildly different reasons. And then it accelerated under Trump because he launched a trade war, and then accelerated more under COVID. And now it's accelerated under Biden because Biden's even more economically nationalist. And now we've hit the wall.
Wow. So, is there a way to avoid this? You mentioned
No.
imperialism or mercantilism. Neither sound very appealing if you're on the wrong end of that. Imperialism, we kind of know what that is, right? We go and take over some other place. Mercantilism, what is that? I remember vaguely learning about this in high
Mercantilism is
school.
basically what we're hitting. It's where
Hmm.
you exercise a degree of trade restriction in order to limit people's access to your market, but you try to shove stuff down their throats to destroy their local industry whenever you can. Certainly, the first part of that is going to be the norm for the next several years. The second part, we'll see what happens once the supply chains have been relocated. Now, and I realize this is ugly. In the United States, this is 10% plus inflation for several years as we get all this stuff in place. Same in Mexico, same in Canada. But on the backside, we will have a supply chain system that employs people from the continent that is simpler and shorter with fewer steps, that is cleaner, that uses less energy. And at the end of it, when it's done, we will have a supply chain system that is largely immune to international crises. And we're going to have record economic growth while we're building this. This is going to be a great story. High inflationary, yes, but people forget about the high growth part. Now, that's assuming you are affiliated with the North American network, as we basically take our marbles and go home.
I
If
see.
you are someone else trying to sell in, you've got to cut a deal. And there are not a lot of countries that have pre-positioned themselves like that.
And this is because America has the beneficial defensible geography, a lot of skilled labor, the ability to bring in immigrants, a lot of the raw material, the things we talked about before.
Because the
So
shale revolution, the cheapest energy in the world, and the largest cluster of millennials for consumption in the world.
shale revolution being that we can get oil out of shale, which is something that I guess was too expensive before, just for people that haven't heard that
Yeah,
that
so
term.
the shale technologies as of 15 years ago when the sector started, it probably cost you about 100 to $150 a barrel to produce the stuff. Now we're below 35.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show.
And skilled labor, you mentioned this earlier. You sort of hinted at this, and I said I wanted to get to it. High skilled labor is going to be leaving other countries and coming to America, in part because, well, furthering the demographic crisis those countries are having. But why else is this going to happen? Just simply because we're going to see that growth, and maybe it's not going to happen in those other places.
If you've got growth and security in food supply and energy supply here and you don't other places, people will vote with their feet. Unfortunately, we're in the process of a bit of a political reshuffling here in the United States, and the factions that make up the parties are moving around. And the faction that is most in play is organized labor. And the issue that they are strongest on is not wanting an open migration system. So we are incapable at the moment in the United States for having a meaningful conversation about migration. And until that passes, until we know where organized labor ends up, uh, we are missing a wonderful opportunity here to take the best and the brightest from the rest of the world. And it's not just an issue of providing labor. I mean, think about it. If somebody has a college degree, that means they have 16 years of education. And if they come to the United States, a foreigner comes to the United States, that means someone else paid for that. I mean, it's like by the numbers, immigration's brilliant.
So, who gets screwed in this situation the most? We talked about why America is going to be largely safe from this and even benefit from this. You mentioned if people are part of the North American, I can't remember the word you used, but the sort of North America club, right? Does that mean Mexico and Canada are largely isolated from this because they have the U.S. On their doorstep, for better or for worse?
Canada, if it was on its own, would be totally screwed, but it's attached to the United States via first a bilateral trade deal and then ultimately by NAFTA. And it has a lot of the same defensive capacity. So yes, Canada is going to be just fine. They've got some internal stuff they'll have to shake out, but they always have. So that's that's par for the course.
Hmm.
Mexico is the highest value add economy in the world if you compare the cost of the inputs versus the value of the outputs. And so I would expect Mexico to be one of the three most quickly growing economies in the world for the next 30 or 40 years.
Wow.
There are a short list of other countries, whether that they saw this coming or just sheer luck, have entered into trade deals with the Trump administration and are probably going to be fine. The top of that list is Japan. Japan came to the US seeking a deal, knowing it was going to be humiliating, and Trump obliged. But then when Biden came in, the Japanese made it very clear they don't want to change the terms.
Hmm.
So they saw a lot of these deglobalization and depopulation trends coming a long time ago because they were, in many ways, the cutting edge. They are the demographically the oldest society in the world. And so they knew that they had to have access to a real market. So that whole Toyota mantra of build where you sell, that's not just a slogan. That's a national survival strategy for the Japanese. And they have found a way to swallow their pride and attach themselves to NAFTA. So I think they're going to be okay. I'd watch Southeast Asia pretty closely. We've got good relations with most of them. The one that matters the most by far is Vietnam. Good educational system, decent demographic structure, and they're trying to leapfrog China in terms of technological aptitude, and they're doing a decent job of
Hmm.
it. They are definitely the country that has benefited the most from China dropping pieces of the manufacturing systems.
Do we think China is going to? I use words like survive, and I know it sounds dramatic, so I want to avoid doing that. But
No, it's
I
all right.
think
Survive's the right word. And
survive is the
no,
right word. Yeah. I mean, do we see parts of China surviving this demographic crisis, this global deglobalization crisis, and joining global markets again? I mean, it's just so hard to imagine a place like Shanghai, right on the ocean, tons of educated people, tons of infrastructure, just being like, well, this place sucks, everybody out. I mean, it seems like they would
there's nowhere to
figure
go.
there is nowhere to go, right? And also, but there's a lot of talent there. There's a lot.
Yeah.
Just a lot there. Is it possible we're going to see a Hong Kong style, almost like a separation, a cutout of a place like Shanghai and some of these other markets and in places in China that
Let me
do
give you
well?
the caveat first, especially when you're talking about demographics in China, we can only rely on the data we have.
Right,
And
which is
with the
provided by
Chinese
the
now
CCP.
admitting publicly that it's all been fabricated,
Hmm.
this fastest aging society in human history, that's the fabricated story. That's the best case scenario. The reality is significantly worse. And even if you believe the data on its face, Shanghai and Beijing already have the lowest birth rate of any metros in human history. So
Wow.
the pace of the disintegration here is really difficult to wrap your mind around. And I think disintegration is the word. We are looking at the end of China as a political entity within a decade or two, and as an and an economic entity within a decade. Whether or not
Wow.
the CCP survives that, that is an open question, because for the CCP, economic growth is no longer perceived as the path to legitimacy. So the politics can go in a lot of weird directions. But let's talk about the country as a whole. It will not be able to hold together. It will not be able to fuel and feed itself. And in that sort of environment, the capacity of Beijing and the northern core to control all the outlying territories is absolutely going to come into question. Now, China has only existed as a unified entity for about 10% of its 3 millennia of history. It is usually fractured apart.
Mm.
And in situations where it has been together and then it's broken down, what usually happens is the northern zone turns into a famine-redded hellscape, where there's not energy, there's not food, there's a bit of a low-grade civil war, and the central government is desperate to oppress people into unity. And it's an ugly, ugly place to live. They'll probably lose half of their population in the
Oh
north.
my God. Like because of migration or because of starvation and
Starvation.
oh God, that's terrible.
Then the southern cities from Shanghai on south, you're right. This is where the value add is. This is where the cosmopolitan is. This is where the bulk of the higher value added manufacturing is. And this is where foreigners are more exposed and where we might actually feel it. If northern China were to vanish tomorrow, we might not notice.
Yeah.
But those southern cities, that's the part that's internationally wired. So historically speaking, these cities become de facto independent city states, and they interface with foreign countries and companies in order to access technology and finance and food. And then that's metabolized by local labor to participate in an international supply chain of some form. And then everything in the interior regresses.
China's no stranger to this, right? They've had, I mean, we're talking about Macau, Hong Kong, probably also Shanghai earlier in its history were really kind of isolated little economic city states that in many ways kind of still are. And they could just go back to that mode. I don't know how much
there's
the
a
Communist
very
Party's gonna
strong
like
model
it.
here for most of the last
Yeah.
1500 years. Those city states have imported most of their food from abroad. It's only in this most recent iteration that they've been interlinked in terms of economics and food supply in northern China. This is a very new development for China.
China, how are they even stable now? I mean, look, the obvious answer is there's a lot of repression, and the CCP is a very strong centralized authority. They must spend for stability. They must spend a lot of money.
Well, let's look at the outside and then work towards the inside. So on the
Okay.
outside, they can still access global energy. They can still access global food. They can still access global food inputs. As long as that is going on, people will be fed and the lights will be on. Now, they are utterly incapable of influencing those events. So when they break, there's nothing the Chinese can do about it. And we're probably going to see in the next few months significant energy failures out of the Russian space, where the Chinese are going to bear the disproportionate burden of that. So we don't have to wait too long for the external environment to look nasty. Internally, when you've got this heterogeneous system, the two things you do are, number one, you beat the crap out of anyone who steps out of line.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a national security state in every way you can imagine it. And then second, you basically pay everyone to be on the same side. So, we bitch in the United States about the Federal Reserve and QE and devaluing the dollar and printing currency and debt spending and all that. Yeah. That's a relevant conversation to have. The Chinese do it about an order of magnitude more than we do.
Huh. Wow.
So everything that, if you're a gold bug, everything you believe about the United States, it's much more true for the People's Republic. Now, they do not have an internationalized financial system, so this all stays bottled up. One of the reasons why whenever the Chinese do try to liberalize their account so they can be a global currency, or whatever the spasm of the day happens to be, $1 trillion floods out in a matter of months as people try to get their money to someplace where it'll hold its value. But it doesn't take much to pop that, because basically we're looking at subprime, the American subprime experience, but not just across the entire housing sector, but in every economic sector. And the subsector of China where this financial hyper financialization is most exposed is agriculture. So they're going to get hit from labor, from finance, and raw material supply all at the same time.
Oh,
That's going to
man.
kill 500 million people.
That's it's so crazy to think about. I thought they were mostly going to. I thought it would be the real estate bubble that pops, right? Because
That's a possibility.
the only place to invest in China, if you're a Chinese, is essentially to buy an apartment that's not built yet somewhere else, with the promise that the value is going to go up, and then the developer often will just not build it or build the concrete structure, and then there's nothing else. So the value kind of never, in many of these places, that's why you have those ghost cities that are built but are kind of not finished, and then no one lives there, and there's nothing there. And it's like,
that
this is
very well could be
investment.
the proximate cause. Just remember, we're dealing with somebody who's walking on a tightrope between two pickups going 90 down the highway if they go off a cliff into a whirlpool where a meteor is hitting. It doesn't really matter what the proximate cause is.
Right. Okay.
Any of these things can end it.
Right, right. No, that actually makes sense. It seems like a very fragile ecosystem financially. Well, not just financially. I mean, with all of these different inputs, and I think again to sort of clarify, the shipping. What are we really afraid of with these shipping routes? If the United States isn't securing them, are there really that many pirates out there going and disrupting these things, or are we worried about something else? Because I think a lot of people are like, wait, so now nothing's going to be able to get shipped if the Navy pulls out?
There's a number of ways this can broke down. The history of maritime transport is very rich with examples of security threats. So, you've got pirates, you've got state pirates, or basically, people using their navy to do stuff. And then you've got privateering, which are private entities that have kind of a state charter in terms of having a place to fuel and sell their booty. It's fun that is becoming part of the lexicon again. Uh, but let's focus on insurance. You can't sail anywhere. You can't leave port without an insurance policy. And at the moment, an insurance policy costs about 1% the value of the ship itself to be paid out in installments over a 12-month period. So
Oh, wow.
1%
Millions
is the
of
total.
dollars.
Yeah, but it's only 1%. Now, that assumes that no one is shooting at anyone anywhere. If you sail into an area where there is a conflict, the cost of that policy increases by a factor of 100
Oof.
to be paid weekly. That assumes that no one is shooting at civilian shipping. If
Right, that's
that
just
happens,
accidental. You might hit a mine
Right.
kind of stuff. If
yeah,
people
you
are
might
going
be,
after
you're in
the
a
ships.
bad neighborhood, so we're going to charge you more.
Right.
But if someone starts shooting at a civilian vessel, you cannot get an insurance policy at all. So the Europeans have set up an environment with this price cap where a lot of countries in Northern Europe now have a financial and security reason to go after Russian shipping. I would argue that the more China acts like a bag of dicks, the more countries in Southeast Asia are developing an interest in going after that shipping. And while I don't think the Chinese are going to ever go after Taiwan, I think it would be national suicide. We are in an environment where that is plausible. And I can totally see the US Navy, the guarantor of global maritime shipping, stopping the oil flows from the Persian Gulf to the Chinese coast. It doesn't happen to have to happen everywhere. The whole world doesn't have to be a no-sail zone. You just need it to happen in a handful of environments to raise the cost of shipping to a point that most manufacturing no longer makes sense. Because remember, if you've got a 1,000-step supply chain, transport has to be no more than 2 or 3% of the cost of the entire thing. So shipping from step to step to step to step has to be cheap, has to be quick, has to be reliable, has to be safe. If you change that, if you just increase the cost of shipping by double, you've already eliminated over half of the global manufacturing supply steps viability. That doesn't take a you don't have to move the needle very far to get there.
Right, that makes sense, right? Because all we need to do is double the cost of some transistor that goes in something, and it's like, well, that now it no longer makes sense to have that thing made in China. It's actually twice the price to ship it, so we might as well make it in, I don't know, literally anywhere else where we can at least get it safely and in reliable numbers. And these little, it's almost like you've got a beverage in front of you, and someone's got a little dropper, and they have motor oil in there. And they go bloop, and you go, damn it! Now I can't drink
anymore.
Right, right. Like most of it is still fine. But it's enough that is enough to make it impossible, or at least very inadvisable, to take another swig of that old fashioned, because there's something in there, and maybe you can't even see where it is until it's too late. So, and this is a tortured metaphor here, I suppose, but this seems like we really don't need a lot of disruption in a lot of different areas to make the whole thing get screwed up. And oil comes to mind, right? If we have Russian, African, Middle East, North African oil without American overwatch, then once production is offline, even for a few months, the wells might freeze up. The workers go home and find different jobs. The equipment stops working or falls into disrepair. You can't just then go back, turn the heater on, crank the thing up and start drilling the oil again. It doesn't really work like that from what I understand.
It depends where you are. In Siberia, it certainly doesn't work that way. And a lot of offshore, it certainly doesn't work that way. Some oil production, actually a lot of oil production is a little bit more modular in that regard. But once you break down the rule, like just to pick something here, South Sudan, not a place that I would ever put my money, but they are an oil producer. If that shuts down for any reason, and you're dealing with civil collapse and breakdown and civil war already, no one's going to go back. It's like there's an
Right.
argument to maintain things once they're running because you've got it all in place. But once the moneymaker is gone for like a year, it's not like you can just walk back in and start operations up. And that's going to be the case in Iran, and that is going to be the case in Libya, and that's going to be the case in parts of Algeria. And we've forgotten in 2022 that the Middle East is a bit of a disaster. It's like with the drama of Ukraine war, we're just like, oh my, thank God that the Middle East is calm. It's not. Nothing's changed there, except the United States is no longer present. So the next time we have a crisis, someone else gets to deal with it.
Peter Zeihan talked about this on the show, that demographics were kind of like a time bomb waiting to go off in China and in Russia. Although in Russia, they're like running towards the brick wall of demographics. And some of the most advanced countries in the world are going to become, for lack of a better word, incredibly old over the coming decades. And we're going to have 1 in 5 people over 65. And usually what population is the opposite of that? Is that correct? Am I close?
Yeah, so for most of human history, we've grown, albeit at a very slow rate. So for about, well, certainly the past 10,000 years of civilization, humans have grown in terms of their overall size on the planet. It really wasn't until about 150 years ago that our population started to explode. In fact, from about 1920 until today, the world population quadrupled in size, from 2 billion to 8 billion people. So for those of us who are living on the planet, we have this expectation that populations are always going to continue to grow. And for those of us who are here today, at an exponential rate. But that's not the truth. In fact, many countries are starting to see a plateauing, if not a reversal, of their populations in terms of overall size. And believe it or not, the UN says by 2086, the global population stops growing. However, there's a consensus of people that are saying, people like me, that are saying it's actually going to happen a lot sooner than that, maybe as early as 2050. So we might tap out somewhere between 8.8 and maybe 10 billion people worldwide, and then the global population starts to shrink.
That makes sense. I mean, I'm going to contribute to population decline by dying somewhere after, probably not too far after 2050, and I assume you're going to join me.
I will be there with you, unless, of course, these longevity scientists that are working out in your part of the world in California really figure it out and figure out how to extend human life past the upper limit, which is around 120, 122 today. If they're able to do that, populations might continue to grow for longer periods of time because we'll have people living for longer too.
Right. We'll probably touch on that because I assume that's kind of a thing. But usually population, looks like a pyramid with lots of children at the bottom. And now we're inverting the pyramid where a lot of us are going to be old and maybe semi-coherent and definitely not working by 2050, 2060. And that's a problem. I mean, I will also be a burden to my children. You're welcome.
Yeah, it's a TBD. There's a couple things happening here. You're absolutely right. Population pyramids were the norm for all of human history. Large numbers of children at the bottom, very few small number of people at the very tip top. But those pyramids in the United States, in Western Europe, in Japan and in Korea have really squared off. So now there's parity among generations in this country. So the boomers are about 69 million people. Gen X is about 67 million people. Millennials are 72 million people. And Gen Z is right about 69 million people. So we've never had this before where it's really been squared off like this. In fact, the fastest growing demographic in the world right now, believe it or not, is people over the age of 85.
That's interesting. Why is this happening? I've heard as countries industrialize, they have fewer children, but can we explain why that is?
Well, there's two things that are happening here. There are birth rate collapse, essentially birth rates going into remission, and we're also seeing an increase in longevity. So there are two kind of competing things that are happening here. birth rate decline started around 1760 at the onset of the first industrial revolution. So there is a correlation between declining birth rates and modernization, industrialization. I think it goes one step further than that, because the real drop-off didn't happen until really the last century. And a couple of things happened in sync. Urbanization became normalized. People moved to the cities. It was a different economic order, a different reality for people. Women were educated, started coming into the workforce. The family structure as a whole started to shift. And perhaps the most important thing, the biggest driving factor, is kids survived childhood. You know, when my grandfather was born in 1914, he had a 1 in 2 survival rate to adulthood. I mean, you can imagine. So he was one of 8 kids. The expectation was that only 4 of them would survive to adulthood if they were lucky. And this is a guy, this is a guy who was born into abject poverty on the coal fields of Western Pennsylvania. The fact that any of them survived is remarkable.
Yeah.
Fast forward to today, notwithstanding the United States and the challenges we're facing with gun violence and automobile deaths, for the most part, kids survive into adulthood everywhere in the world. There's like a 90+ survival rate. So because of that, we don't necessarily need to have more kids. So better education, more women at work, better access to contraceptives, and the fact that we don't need children necessarily as an economic unit of the household anymore, all really contribute in this perfect storm, if you want to look at it that way, to a decrease in birth rates.
All the younger people that I talk to, and here's the problem with this, right? I'm talking to younger people who are like, no, I want to go travel around Europe. So their minds change. But I don't know anybody right now, aside from people in their 40s and late 30s, who want kids. And I feel like when I was younger, all my friends said they wanted kids eventually. And now I don't hear anybody saying anything like that. Now, again, sentiments can change. But when I ask the reason, it's not just, oh, I want my own money, I want my own freedom. It's, I can't afford to live without roommates. I'm paying off my car and I'm a doctor and I have 2 roommates and a Prius, or something along those lines. Or I don't know, there's a war over there and it could be that the world isn't a good place to be. And so I don't want to bring anybody into that. I mean, these are things that I never heard in the late 90s, 2000, early aughts. Never did anybody say anything like that. And I'm wondering if the sentiment that the world is a dangerous place and too expensive and yada yada is contributing to this as well.
I certainly think one of the primary drivers is fear. People don't have children when things are bad. So even though things are relatively good worldwide now, we're not getting those messages every day. Every day on the radio, the television, social media, we hear about how the world is falling apart. It's not really. It's not really falling apart, but those messages stick. There's another piece to this, though, Jordan, that I think is really important, and people seem to miss it every time because we don't look at long-term data. Essentially, if you look at the trends across the board, there are vertical trends and there are horizontal trends. The vertical trends, essentially where things are just going up in price at an astronomical rate, are things like housing, education, healthcare, even long-term care for our parents and our grandparents. You know the one trend line that stays almost static from 1965 till today? Wage growth.
Oh, yeah. So, I could have guessed. I should have
No. You don't have to, because not a lot of people do. But because wage growth has remained relatively static against all of these other pressures, people have to make choices. We're rational human beings at the end of the day. So if you're looking at your pocketbook and saying, man, I'd love to have kids, but I can't afford them, that's why. That's why, because all of these pressures are here. And most of us, I think most of the people who are listening to your show, we grew up in nuclear families for the most part. So we grew up in a 2-parent household with 2 kids, maybe a dog or a cat, and that was normal. The normal family is gone. The normal family has changed. In fact, there are really 3 types of living situations in this country right now, 2 of which are on a growth pattern, one of which is actually in decline. The nuclear family is in decline. The growth of the intergenerational family is on the rise. Multiple generations living within one household. Grandma, the adult children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and single households. They're also on the rise in this country. So people are making decisions based on the economic realities in front of them. Some people are choosing to bind together as a larger family unit, the long-term historical tradition of families. Other people are saying, I'm out. I'll be single or I'll be coupled. We're not going to have kids because we can't afford it.
The people who are telling me they don't want to have kids, by the way, I'm not necessarily talking about random show fans in email. I mean, even in my bubble here in Silicon Valley, or friends and family who work for like Tesla making 150 grand a year, or lawyers who I know that are successful, even they're saying I can't afford it. So I can only imagine what somebody who makes $45,000, $65,000 a year is thinking. Now, they probably live in a place with a lower cost of living, but the problem is going to be even more real for somebody like that. So if 1%ers are like, I don't know if we can afford kids, that's very problematic.
Yeah.
That just seems like the perception almost seems insurmountable at that point.
Yeah, and you also have another competing trend here. You know, you've talked a lot about 35-year-olds, people who are kind of traditional parents. Non-traditional parents are on the rise too, and I mean from an age-based perspective. You know, women in their 40s are the fastest growing group of mothers in this country today, and they're able to be mothers. They're able to have what our doctors refer to as geriatric pregnancies, you know, because of science, and also because, you know, women are healthier today than they were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, and they're able to take on these pregnancies with greater ease. Some of the reason people do defer pregnancy until later in life is because of those financial reasons. And then they can augment parenting with a nanny or a night nurse or an au pair, where they wouldn't have been able to do that in their 30s. Even a $150,000 job, they need to go a little bit further to get over the hump.
All right. I want to talk about not just the United States and population in general, but especially places like Russia, because, of course, look, the older population in the U.S., it's going to stress the tax base. Wages are going to rise. We're going to have fewer workers. Products are going to be marketed differently. I'm imagining, you know, future Apple Watches can remind not only time your run, they can remind you to change the baby's diaper. You might have to even change your own diaper. I don't know. It's just going to be completely different. There's so much we can talk about with population, but I'd love to talk about Russia and China, because I think that's where we're going to see major issues. Now, the United States, I wondered why we weren't seeing our population shrink, and I guess it's because we just have tons of immigrants coming in. And if you're Russia, I don't know. People may be going the other way. That's what the news is telling me. Not that that's always correct, but I don't see a ton of immigration to Russia being very likely, at least anytime soon.
Yeah, ain't nobody's moving to Russia.
No.
And more people are leaving than staying. In fact, you know, something between 30,000 and 60,000 Russians tried to cross the southern border last year alone. That's according to our own Customs and Border Patrol. They're desperate to try to get out, mostly young men. And of course, the war in eastern Ukraine has certainly sped up this demographic time bomb that really Russia created on its own. But there's another thing at play here. You know, this goes back to your previous point about people not liking to have babies during bad times. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, Russia saw a pretty significant dip in their birth rates. It was a period of economic, political, social instability, and people stopped having babies. Well, fast forward 30 years. Those babies that were born are now thrust into another politically, economically, socially unstable time. So we're witnessing a double dip in the drop of birth rates in Russia. At the same time, Russia's actually seeing a pretty significant reversal in their lifespan. It's below 70 years now. I think about 69 years is the average lifespan for a Russian. It's lower for men, a little bit higher for women. But it's really a catastrophe in the making, because, like you said, when you pull young people out of the country, you're pulling them out of the economy, you pull them out of the workforce. And that really grinds the economy to a halt. And of course, there are things you can do to mitigate that. You can increase labor force participation for older people. You can increase the use of technology to improve productivity. But Russia doesn't even have any markets really to sell to. They essentially sell food, gas, and military equipment. That's what they do there. And they do it pretty well. I mean, their energy is great. Their military arms are great. Their food serves a significant portion of the world. But if you can't get people to make the machinery, you can't get people to harvest the fields, so what?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And now you can't buy foreign machinery because you're under sanction because you invaded another country. Now you can't get a lot of what you need. You're buying crap from China that can't make what you need. And yeah, that's it.
Exactly.
That's all.
So I think really an unintended consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it sped up this demographic catastrophe that's laid at their feet, and it's actually pushed them into to greater levels of dependency with a country like China because they still will trade with them.
And ironically, or depending on who you agree with here, it seems like the invasion of Ukraine was almost, if you're listening to Peter Zeihan, for example, an attempt at restoring the empire, grabbing more population, grabbing more, people who can run things, and it sort of it spectacularly backfired and ended up with something, estimates range, but what, like 1 million people have left? And these are prime young men who would be working and are now leaving. And it's maybe 1 million or it's maybe a few 100,000. And then a few 100,000 more are fighting in Ukraine. And then another, 100,000 are dead or injured. And so therefore out of the game. It's like that was just a crazy self-own in terms of trying to jumpstart your population growth.
Yeah, I mean, I call it Putin's folly. Because in many respects, he brought this on himself. And I think Peter's right. This was one last grab while they had the population to take back territory they believe is theirs. And there is a cultural component to this. Kiev is the birthplace of modern Russia. People don't connect the dots there because we don't understand history. But the modern Russian people were descendants of the people that were living in Ukraine. So there's a long-term history that goes to the desire of Mother Russia to take back, its children that split off after the fall of the Soviet Union. But it really is short-sighted because Ukraine has similar demographics to Russia. So they're making a grab for another country that was essentially also in, to some degree, demographic decline. They've really just sped up the process for both nations to slip into a demographic obscurity.
I've got word from another friend of mine who said something along the lines of fighters on the front line are pushing age 40, which is not great if you are. And I don't know if that was just Ukraine or if that was Russia and Ukraine, but that's saying something when you're putting past their prime old farts like me in a trench. That's not a winning strategy.
Right. I don't belong on the battlefield at 45. No. I can tell you that right now.
Man.
But that estimate is actually pretty consistent. It's been verified by a number of different sources. And I believe it's more for the Ukraine side than the Russian side, although I would have to go back and double check that. One thing that has been consistent is the life expectancy in a city like Bakhmut, where reports come out that say that life expectancy for the men who are there now and the women, because both men and women are fighting in this conflict, is about 4 hours.
4 hours.
4 hours.
That's truly horrifying.
Horrifying is an understatement. And that just shows how difficult the fighting is. Now, let's be clear. Older men, older women have fought in wars before. In fact, during the Second World War, it wasn't unusual for really young men to try to enlist, people that were below the enlistment age, and really older men. In fact, my grandfather was a Seabee in the Navy, the guys that actually rebuilt the Pacific after the U.S. Navy and Marines went through. And he worked with men who were upwards of 65 in that unit.
Wow.
And these guys had lied to get in because they believed in the larger goal. Now, I think you can say for the Ukraine side, based on the reports that are coming out, these men are going willingly. On the Russian side, not so much. They're being pulled in without their will.
I can't get rid of the 4 hour thing. I can't get past the 4 hour thing. Explain to me what that means. Does that mean I get off a bus and I'm going to fight in Bakhmut and they give me a rifle and a helmet and 4 hours by afternoon, by lunchtime, I'm dead? Is that what that means?
That's a numbers game. So obviously we're talking about not simply just 4 hours, but the rate at which people are being killed on whole comes out to average to be 4 hours. So you might live throughout the conflict. There are plenty of people that do, but on average, that's what the grind looks like. That's why it's so appropriate that Bakhmut and eastern Ukraine are really called the meat grinder now, because so many people are dying in that region. And this is completely avoidable. This is completely avoidable.
Yeah, so the way you just put it is, if somebody lives throughout the entire conflict, or let's say makes it a couple of months, that means other people lasted minutes on the battlefield to create that average.
Entirely possible. Entirely possible. It's gruesome. It's gruesome.
Yeah,
I mean, war is ugly, and the reality is that most of us that are alive on this planet today, at least in the Western world, have not lived through a conflict like this, a traditional on-the-ground slog. We've seen things like Operation Desert Storm, the actions in Afghanistan that have shown a very sophisticated military using air as the primary tactic for dominance. This is ground. This is hand-to-hand. It's a lot different, and it's a lot higher human cost at the end of the day.
Gosh, gruesome is there are no words to describe something like that. I mean, you read about Stalingrad and things like that, and that's what it sounds like.
It's Stalingrad 2.0 in a different place.
Yeah.
And with slightly different actors. And of course, this begs the question, what is the future of war? If these countries are actually decreasing in size, they don't have the people to fight anymore. Are they going to be using non-traditional tactics? Is cyber war going to become more common? Is economic war going to become de rigueur? It's all very possible, and we're starting to see some of that. Russia's been a nuisance for years now as it relates to cyber crimes against the United States and its allies. I certainly think that we're going to see more of that. We're also starting to see an economic offense by the BRICS, led largely by China, to try to create a secondary currency, a shadow currency to the United States, so that we can't leverage things like sanctions against these countries anymore. That's part of the reason they want to do this, to build a separate economic bloc to compete with us directly. It's a form of warfare.
Right now, we're in what you've described as a global fertility crisis. Can you describe in brief what that is?
Sure. So when we look at where a typical man's sperm count is, it's about half of what it was 40 years ago. And that is more or less alarming, depending on how much you understand this. So, it does take only one sperm to conceive a child. So you might think, okay, I just need one and I'm good to go. But it's not actually like, it's kind of like a lottery. And you want to have a lot of,
tickets
invested in.
Yeah.
And so you really need those millions of sperm, believe it or not, in order to get one that's going to make it through and do the job. And so here's how it works with sperm count. When it's high, and that's anything I would say over 60 is going to be plenty. That's 60 million sperm per milliliter. That's a lot of sperm. Over that, it doesn't matter a lot. So whether you have 60 or 70 or 90 or 100, it's kind of the same chances of getting somebody pregnant, each time you try. But when you drop below 50, 45, and where exactly that is up for grabs, but somewhere down there, it's getting harder. And the lower the number, the harder it is to get somebody pregnant. And how do you know that? It takes longer. It takes more tries. It takes more months. And one of the things that people look at is the probability of conceiving on a given cycle, right? And so that number goes down really rapidly when you go below 40. So where are we now? Last time we looked, when we published in 2021, we were at 47 million sperm per milliliter, and that's for a typical man. And we can talk about what that is. Okay. And so 47, you can see, is pretty close to the point at which it's getting harder to conceive. It's taking longer. It's taking more tries. And when that number drops lower and lower to zero, of course, there's zero chance of getting anyone pregnant, no matter how long you try, right? No sperm, no go. And then, but it turns out it drops off pretty rapidly. So where we are now at 47 is pretty close to the point where a substantial number of men and couples are going to have trouble conceiving a child. the usual way, that is without assistance. That's where we are now. And the reproductive crisis doesn't stop with sperm. There's a lot of other measures of reproductive health for men, like their level of testosterone, which is also in trouble. We could talk about that. And for women, frequent miscarriage, repeated miscarriage, menstrual problems, premature ovarian failure. That means fancy name for saying not enough eggs left at the end of your reproductive life, right? And also there's endometriosis, there's polycystic ovarian syndrome, and so on and so forth. So all kinds of things can go wrong, and they are. And the result is that world fertility has dropped in part because of these things, also 50%. So we have a 50% drop in sperm count. We have a 50% drop in fertility worldwide, and increases in all the bad things like testicular cancer and miscarriage and blah, 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 blah. So it doesn't look good. It's not a healthy picture. It's not leading to reproductive health.
What can we learn from the animal world in terms of the fertility crisis? You know, you hear people, including total, nut jobs like Alex Jones, who I'm sure people have quoted this to you, like, there's chemicals in the water turning the frogs gay, right? Have you heard this guy?
Yeah.
But that's like the one thing that he wasn't completely insanely off about, right? And maybe they're
That's
not
correct.
gay frogs, but there's things in the water that are turning the frogs into, I guess you'd call it ambiguous genitalia, is what you wrote in the book?
Yeah. And actually, my colleague Tyrone Hayes can actually produce in the laboratory frogs that prefer to mate with other male frogs. So a male
so they
frog.
are
Yeah,
gay
right?
frogs.
They
Oh my gosh.
are gay frogs, and
right.
and that happens actually in the wild. And so what Tyrone wanted to do is make sure it was causal, and to do that, you do an experiment, and he did that, and he showed that was true. And then you have also observations like smaller genitalia, like shorter penises in alligators when they're exposed to pesticides, and other animals having shorter, organs and so on. So it's definitely possible that we can learn that. But there's something else we can learn from animals, which is if we want to know whether a chemical is going to harm us, what we would be well to do is to test it on an animal first, an animal that has a similar system to ours. So if we're worried about reproduction, we want an animal like a rodent is very good for looking at reproductive health. Other animals, pigs are good for other things, how pregnancies, advance and so on. So depending on the system that you're looking at, you want to pick an animal that's going to reflect development in humans. And then you can do an experiment. So you can't do an experiment on us, although we kind of are part of a massive experiment. We can talk about that. But, you can't get approval from to assign these women to take phthalates and these women not to take phthalates, for example. You can't do that. That's not ethical.
No, it's not ethical. Right. We're just doing it to ourselves without any permission because we're putting, face cream on that has it in there already.
Right. So we have the option to do it to ourselves, and we are. But in terms of me doing it in an experiment, I can't do that. But we can to animals. So what that means is we can actually do a controlled experiment, exposed, unexposed, when they're exposed, how much they're exposed, and learn a lot of things about risk. What's the most risky period? What's the most risky dose? And so on, right? So that's something we can learn from animals. Yeah.
I've heard also that younger folks are less interested in sexual activity these days, and that's sort of contributing to this. I mean, look, that's maybe a different cause. It's not chemicals in the environment, or are chemicals in the environment causing less interest in sexual activity? I guess maybe we don't even know, right?
We have some clues. And I would say it's probably, like everything else, complicated and due to lots of causes. But just to give you an example, the study that I've conducted for a long time, it's called TIDES. Just call it TIDES. So in TIDES, we asked women about their interest in sex and about their satisfaction with their sex life. And it turned out that those that had more phthalates in their urine at the time they answered this question were less satisfied with their sex life.
Huh.
That's pretty dramatic. And it's on the female side. It also happens on the male side, so that when you lower testosterone, as you probably know, you have lots of problems with libido, interest, and also with the ability, like erectile dysfunction. And that has been going up. And it's related to all of these chemicals that we're exposed to.
I can identify. Look, when I was younger, I was going through like business stress, and I just had like, I don't, 2020 hindsight is probably a little depressed, but I just didn't see it in the moment because I was like 29, 30 years old. I was like, what do I have to be sad about? And I was stressed out a lot, and you could have plopped the most beautiful woman in front of me, and I would have been like, what's on TV, man? In fact, don't even turn on the TV. I'm going back to bed. That I just couldn't have cared less.
Right.
And so I imagine that plus chemical exposure, plus stress, plus moving to an urban environment and not being able to afford a house and having $100,000 in student loans or whatever, like that kind of thing, that'll do it, man. That's the boner killer right there for a lot of people.
Right. Stress is a very, very big driver of sexual problems, definitely. But what I'm here to tell you is that chemicals also can do this. And so you have a confounding, if you will, of your lifestyle, factors, for example, obesity, actually. For example, let's take obesity. Obesity is not good for your sperm count. It's not good for your testosterone. It's not good for your sexual libido, right? And if in addition, you're being exposed to these chemicals that can also affect these functions, then you're getting a double whammy. And sometimes they even interact. So you have a worse effect if you're obese than if you're not.
Right. Yeah. Oh man. As we know, a lot of or Westerners, but Americans especially, we're not getting any thinner as a population. Most of us.
Right. And that, by the way, if you read the book Obesity, there's a book on obesogens, things that cause obesity. The same chemicals that cause reproductive problems are causing obesity. So don't take it just for me. Look it up. Obesogens. It's well known in our field that this is another area, along with reproductive function, along with neurodevelopment, that are being affected by these chemicals.
And of course, sex drive and the ability to lose weight quickly are often, I would say, associated with testosterone in men anyway. Actually, probably in everyone.
Absolutely.
And so if testosterone is indeed getting lower, and you mentioned that sort of in the open of the show, that would affect sperm count, desire to have sex in the first place, your weight, and then possibly cause a spiral, right? Because then you're getting bigger, you're less interested, your testosterone goes down even further. Like it just doesn't, there's no sort of check there.
Right. It's not a pretty picture.
No.
So, yeah.
This could lead to demographic collapse. I don't want to be dramatic, right? But I mean, if we're talking about people having fewer kids and that spreading across a whole population, we see things like that in China, Japan, Korea, where there's just not enough young people to produce, uphold the GDP, take care of older folks. Are you worried about that at all, or is that sort of outside your area of study?
I'm definitely worried about that. And let's talk about Japan for a minute. In Japan, there is a lot of really interesting media stuff that you can look up. You can look up Rent a Family. That's
yeah, I've seen this.
Rent a Family in Japan. You can also have Rent a Stranger if you want to be somewhere like going out to dinner but not be seen eating alone. You can rent a stranger. You have women marrying themselves. They prefer not to marry a man. They marry themselves because that's simpler. And I guess they don't have the drive then to marry a man. So there are all these really scary developments. And they've produced what's called a loneliness epidemic in Japan. So it's not only loneliness in terms of your contact, it's also loneliness in terms of your family and your inability to actually reproduce. So there's a very, very low fertility rate, as you mentioned, in many parts of Asia. So that's in Singapore and South Korea and Japan and Hong Kong and so on. And the interesting thing is that the government has tried to turn this around, right? They've tried to offer incentives, like subsidized housing, for people with children. And if you have more children, more subsidies and so on and so forth. And it's actually not working. So the governments have not figured out how to incentivize people to have more children. And it's a problem.
Yeah, I think China's going through something similar where they had the one-child policy for so long. Now they have a two-child policy, and I think you can have three if you live outside a major city. And everyone I know, I take Chinese lessons all the time, and I know all these young Chinese people because of that. And they're like, I'm never having kids, or they're like, I'll have one. I'm not going to have more than one. It's too expensive. It's like the last thing, even if they subsidize your housing, it's like, cool, well, are you going to pay for all of the other things I have to pay for on my meager salary in order to raise a kid in any remote, anything that resembles a city? No, not really. And even if they did it, it's hard to turn the culture around. Right. If your parents had one kid and you had one kid and now you're supposed to have, suddenly your grandkids are supposed to have three, like, nah, come on.
Right.
It's not going to happen.
Right. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And by the way, the people that are having children, more and more of them are having them through assisted reproduction, going to the medical route because they can't do it on their own. So that makes it more challenging as well. Assisted reproduction is expensive. It's also painful to the woman if you choose certain routes, and it's just difficult. Add to that many people don't become aware of the problem until they're pretty old.
Yeah.
So you have this aging problem, which is confounding this, acting on top of it. So you have older people who might have been able to get pregnant when they were younger, or guys who have been able to do it when they were younger. But then when they're older, things aren't working as well. And so you got that double whammy from age and chemicals.
Because people are waiting longer to have kids and urbanizing and things like that.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
Right. So I guess if I wait till I'm 35 or 37, like I did, I think I was 37 or 38 when I had my first kid. If I wait till then and I'm like, man, I've been trying for a year or two. I'm 39, 40 now. What's going on? Oh, well, you have this problem that you've had pretty badly for the last, 10 years, 8 years. The window may have already closed for me to really do anything about that. Whereas if I'd started when I was 28, I might have had a shot. No pun intended.
And in fact, most men don't know. They don't know their semen quality. They don't know their sperm count. I don't know when you found out yours, or if you ever did. Maybe you did. But it's not something that most men know. Most men don't want to even go there. They're like, I'm okay.
Yeah, ignorance is bliss.
Right? If I need it, I'll have it when I need it. And
I did go to a sperm bank when I was younger because I heard, and when I was broke, I heard that if you had a really good education and you were XYZ, this, that, and the other thing, you could get a bunch of money. And so I went in and did the questionnaire, and they're like, oh, you're in the top tier category for all these things, and it's like $1,200 each time. And I was like, where? See you on Tuesdays. Yeah. So that was interesting. But they don't say you have X number of sperm per milliliter. They don't tell you anything. And I think it's because of medical liability reasons. They don't want to be responsible for you having any sort of knowledge on their behalf. They just want to get the goods and get you out the door.
Well, the fact that they took you on and, paid you that $1,200, I assume, means that everything was pretty good. Probably your count, the motility, how it moved, the shape they were in, that's called morphology. That was probably all pretty good. So good for you. But
so far, I got 2 kids now, so it held up. It held up over the next decade.
But if a younger guy, finds that out, that he's good, maybe he wants to bank his sperm. That way, when he gets older, maybe he has more exposures. He's not, not ready when he's young, but he might be ready when he's older. He's got some insurance in the bank. So I'm suggesting, and now it's gotten very easy. There are companies where you don't have to go into the office to give. You can do it at home. You can mail it in. These are reputable, companies. You might want to actually get one of those people on. That's a little aside to you, but
that stuff is interesting. A friend of mine, he had testicular cancer I think we were in our early 30s. So one of the first things he did was go and have his sperm frozen, and he had cancer and chemo and all that, and he made it through just fine. He recently just got married, and he has a kid now because of that. So it was like good forward thinking on his part. So I think, look, if you're young and you think maybe I should have kids, I'd say it's worth a few $100 or whatever it is per year, just to make sure you got that young, super healthy sperm of high quality. Because it's not just quantity, right? It's also quality, or especially quality, maybe.
Right. Yeah. And women have that option as well, although it's not as uncomplicated for women. It's much harder to retrieve the eggs. It doesn't mean it's definitely going to work, but it's something to think about and talk to your doctor about. If you think you want to delay maybe till you're in your late 30s, definitely your chances of conceiving go down rapidly after 35. And your chances of having eggs that have mutations also go up past 35. So if you want to, have an egg that you feel safe and comfortable with, talk to your doctor about whether you should be freezing or not.